Evil comes in many shades and colors across the multiverse, and while we may be able to find a villain in each of those colors within magic, it can be hard to create our own. Why would we do this? Well, a good villain can hold a story together and provide motivations for our characters, but it can be difficult to design. On this channel, we've spent a considerable amount of time designing characters for D&D and creative writing, using the color pie in conjunction with the classes of Dungeons & Dragons. But we never stopped to provide those heroes with a worthy antagonist. In this video, I will be doing just that, designing 5 villains that you can lift straight from this video and apply to your own games or stories. And make sure to stick around till the end, where I will discuss the way in which I put these characters together. Before we begin our discussion, I would just like to say thank you to my patrons for their support. If you would like to help this channel grow, then consider becoming a patron today. With that out of the way, let's start as we always do at the top of the color pie, and design a villain who is white aligned. There have been a string of seemingly random and cruel murders that have been carried out across the region, with no real sign as to the cause. You have been tasked with finding what has been happening. The trail of death leads you to a small village. Nothing seems to be out of place, that is, except for a large gathering at the town center. A man in white robes is speaking to a group of onlookers, with other people in similar ashen color robes at his back. He preaches of purity in a dark time, his voice filled with conviction. You've seen a lot of things in your travels, and this sort of sight isn't out of the ordinary, though the leader does strike you as being above the common doomsayers and mad Puritans you've come across before. There is something gripping about his words, and what frightens you most is how much people are receiving his message with focus and intent. It's as if he has pulled them in with a spell, but you detect nothing. You do notice an emblem on the hoods of those gathered around the speaker, a candle with a flickering flame. In the coming adventure, you learn that this man's name is Cavitus, and his group of followers are the Order of the Pure Flame. They are a cult who believe that the world has descended into darkness and preach words of purity at all costs. And wherever they go, there is guaranteed to be a death and a new follower. None of the violence can be traced back to him directly, and yet it follows him like a shadow. It turns out his words are so strong that his message seems to stick with a member of every village they pass by. That individual is then stricken with the desire to seek out the person in their village whom they deem to be part of the problem. A woman who speaks out is deemed a witch and put to flame. A banker who is portrayed as greedy is stuck with a dagger, or a crook is executed in a cruel manner. The only way to understand more is to make your way into the cult. The problem is that the words of Cavitus are so captivating that you have trouble distinguishing them from the truth when you are around him. It is genuine that his words are a spell, and even though you don't agree with his message, you find yourself drawn to him. What will happen next is up to you. This villain we have created here is one who leans into the side of white that has a sort of moral superiority. They believe anything outside of purity is a sin to be punished, even though they themselves incite violence wherever they go. Cavitus knows exactly what he is doing, but can rationalize his actions by stating that the world is a better place wherever his feet tread. The cleansing flame is but a candlelight now, but will engulf the world, and through the ashes the pure of heart will cultivate that world anew. There are beings out there who hide behind the facade of humanity, using the faces of those you know as a mask to hide who they are. Our blue villain is one such fiend, a shapeshifter. This nameless one has lived many lives, none of which were their own. Some say this entity has been present on this world since its creation, as if it's a part of some grander ethereal force. There are tales of the shifter spanning time and language, from ancient elven tomes, dwarven tales, to human scrawlings. It goes by many names: the Faceless One, Skinwalker, or Baldrosh, the latter being the oldest name and perhaps its true one. Nonetheless, it is a being who is spoken of in tales but rarely seen. It is a being who is driven by a curiosity of mortals, as if it itself is a blank slate who wishes to fill that void with the lives of those unfortunate enough to cross its path and spark intrigue in them. This nameless one consumes the body, mind, and soul of its victim, in turn becoming them in nearly every way. That is, until it is either bored or found out and slain. Unfortunately, its form is an immortal one, or at least it is said to be so, and so it moves on, finds another victim, and the cycle continues. While traveling through a large coastal city, you and your party feel as if you're being followed, and yet there's no particular person doing so, but from time to time you see an inquisitive eye trace your movements through the city. It's not too unusual to feel like you're being watched. Adventurers tend to stand out, but this is different. It all comes to a head one morning as you and your party rise to start your day when you notice something is off with one of your traveling companions. It's not quite obvious, and nothing they say is out of the ordinary, but something isn't quite right. The rest of the party decides it's best to move on, and so you do. What you don't realize is that now with you travels the faceless one, Baldrosh. It seems that your party has sparked its interest, and the guide you came to the coastal city with is present no more, its facade and soul consumed by the Ancient One. This villain in blue is based off two aspects. One is a curiosity to learn, and the other is an indifference to the impact its actions can have on another, while its goals are its focus. It spends its eternal life looking to fill some sort of void in itself by consuming mortal ones, as if by turning the next corner it will learn its own purpose. In some ways it could be seen as a lost and hopeless being, but its actions have dire consequences. Whispers around town are full of talk about the Baron. Something has come over him as of late. His gaze is distant, his actions cruel, and his breath the constant scent of spirits. It's not like he wasn't always a strange man with a bit of a harsh edge to him, but it's as if something in him finally cracked, and yet he is more successful than he's ever been. You see, he wasn't always the Baron of these lands. He was a man of some wealth, sure, with a family line which held sway in these lands for a long time, but they were never truly the ones in charge, just aristocrats of the region. Everything changed though when the previous Baron, a kind man, went mad himself, and in turn appointed Varsikosk as the Baron and fled the land. Ever since then, there has been a darkness over the town, and a wailing coming from the Baron's homestead at night. The villagers beg you and your party to do something about it, to investigate. What you come to learn is that Var, a man of greed and excess, wanted more for himself beyond what his family line had afforded him. Not one to work for what he wanted and a bit of a brat at a young age, Varsikosk used the aid of a witch to call upon his ancestors from beyond death, and in turn, bind them to an amulet. He then used the magic of this amulet to manipulate them into facilitating his greed, and in this way, he drove out the previous Baron. Through this artifact, he is able to command their spirits to act on his behalf. The issue is that this control is not perfect. Having been torn from the underworld, the ghosts of his ancestors are angry at their return and subsequent servitude. So while they heed his command, they still lash out at him whenever they can, making it hard for him to sleep or think, driving him further into drink and cruel madness. He often lashes out on those around him, having innocent people locked up, and even at times executed for the most minor of infractions. The townsfolk beg you to do something about this, and you know you can't pass on to the next town without helping in some way. Being a black-line villain, Var is driven by his greed and desire for power, all without the desire for the actual work it requires. This drives him into taking a shortcut which has dire consequences. This is why he's all too willing to desecrate his ancestors' graves for a little taste of power, with no moral hindrance when faced with his own greed. Long ago lived a general whose vicious campaigns were so brutal that the span of her lifetime is often referred to as the Blood Age. This general went by many names: the Crimson Commander, Mistress of Massacre, or simply the Butcher, among many others. It was said that her campaigns were less focused on taking strategic points, and more a result of her desire to stain the lands red with blood. As she pressed further and further out from her homeland, she would kill many and recruit the rest. Most of her army were made up of those conscripts, but the core of those in her service were die-hard loyalists, who saw her less as their leader and more as their god. Of course, no campaign can last forever, and she was finally defeated by a larger accumulated force. The moon was full and the fight was brutal, so much so that it's said that even the sky turned red that night. It has been 100 years since that fateful evening, and something has begun to stir. The Butcher has returned, signified by the blood moon. Tales of ghastly marauders led by a fierce warrior cloaked in red mist are beginning to spread across the region. The attacks seemingly random, the results are absolute carnage. Those who were alive during the Blood Age are racked with the same fear they had in those days. Something must be done, but why and how has she returned? Could the underworld not hold her rage and bloodthirst? Has a god of war unleashed her upon us to test our mettle? No one knows. The only thing they do know is that when the moon turns red, the Crimson Commander is on her way and death follows suit. This is where you come in. For our red villain, I decided to apply red's potential for bloodlust and carnage, a villain who is driven by the simple pleasures of war and its brutal outcomes. The motivations of the Mistress of Massacre are just that, massacre. She is followed by some loyalists who returned with her to the land of the living, as if tied to her cause, bound to her through rage. Pressed against the bounds of an ever-encroaching civilization lies an ancient wood, one that has sat undisturbed for longer than humanity had been in the region. Of course, humans don't heed old folk tales for long, and they do little to stay the hand of progress. So it wasn't long before a small settlement popped up at its border. Anyone who truly listens to the words of old tales would know this was a bad idea. But all those settlers only saw the endless resources within, which in turn blinded them to its dangers. The horror began one warm and windy night. As the parents slept, the children rose from their beds and walked barefoot out into the forest, not a word passing their lips. In fact, there was no sound other than the wind in the air and the low, deep moaning coming from the woods. A search party would be sent in to look for the children once the village noticed they were gone that morning. With the sun barely up, they made their way inside. They had been on the outskirts of the forest before, chopping down trees and doing some hunting, but never had they stepped so deep inside. At first, they heard the moaning, then they saw the faces. The search party dropped to their knees in horror as they looked upon the expression of their children frozen in twisted shapes, their bodies like trees planted to the ground, their limbs like branches. Then the moaning sound ceased in an instant, the silence followed by large creaking footsteps, and from the brush rose an entity of ancient horror, a visage of bramble and bushes, with eyes that glowed red. It would soon be over for the search party as well. A small handful would manage to flee, but the rest were doomed. It would not be long after this event that your party would come across the village, and what is left of the villagers who stayed. For the green villain, I wanted something of an ancient horror, almost in the style of a cosmic horror villain. In some ways, it is the protector of the forest, and in other ways, the dark heart of it. There are many motivations we could pull from for green to create a villain, but for this one, I wanted something more thematic rather than philosophical. As you can see, the color pie is a useful tool when designing characters, worlds, and in this case, villains. Ones that you can use not just for magic, but for your own Dungeons & Dragons campaigns, stories, and more. What makes the creative process even more interesting, and I would say fun, is the system I used to come up with these villains. You see, what I did is look through my magic cards until I found the first ones that struck me in each color. I tried not to look for a specific card. What I wanted was a bit of a challenge. Then, when I had my 5, one for each color, I built a villain around them in some way. Not necessarily making them into villains, but rather gaining inspiration from them. The cards which inspired this video were Alaru, Solemn Ritualist for white, Undercover Operative for blue, Malevolent Noble for black, Blood Age General for red, and Eudora Gravegardener for green. As you can see, some of them are very close in inspiration, while others tend to drift a bit. If you use this system to make a villain or even a hero, then don't worry if your ideas drift. That just means you had a spark of creativity. Creativity is an amazing thing we all have inside of us, but sometimes we need the right tools for the job. And in that way, I believe the color pie is just that tool. Well, I hope that video sparked your imagination, and if you like this sort of thing, then check out this video here where I discuss villainy in more broad terms in regards to the color pie. I would also like to say thank you once again to my patrons for their support, and with that friends, I'll catch you in the multiverse. Bye.